Okay. See the slides in theory? Brian, you good?
Yeah, we see the slides. And if
All
those
right.
that can't see the slides, just make sure you hit the screen.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Isn't that the truth? So quick introductions as we get started. I am Jay Baer from Convince and Convert. I've been an online marketing and customer experience expert since 1993. That's why I have the soft lighting here. I'm actually much older than you might think. My team and I create lots and lots of live and virtual keynotes every year for corporate clients and associations. We produce virtual events for lots of companies. We've done more than 100 virtual events in the last 5 years. We created, when the pandemic became a thing, an actual virtual event consulting package to help companies figure these things out. Brian does the exact same thing. There he is, Mr. Brian Fanzo.
Yes. Founder of iSocialFans, Brian Fanzo, and digital futurist, keynote speaker. I think we're both unemployed keynote speakers on that side at the moment. We don't have a stage to play on at the moment, but host, MC, and then for me, live video and virtual events were the number one driver for me to generate my speaking business. I've helped launch a lot of Fortune 100, a lot of clients that we both have into live streaming, both webinars, Facebook Live, Instagram. I helped IBM, Dell, Oracle do their very first, live stream. I've actually done a little over 3,000 live streams myself individually, which is way too many. There was the early days of just pressing the damn button a little too much. So, it's fun for me to kind of connect the strategy. So it's, like yourself, I like being able to build strategy, host and MC some of those virtual events, and then as well, as present. And over the last couple of months, I've been really pushing hard on really just educating on the unlimited possibilities available with virtual events. So yeah, this is gonna be a lot of fun. And Jay and I, we've had the opportunity to actually host offline events in the digital capacity, and then host digital events for offline. So this is
it's wild, right?
Yeah, we have to do the whole 360 version of all the things that are going on.
Brian's also creating the ultimate guide to virtual event platforms. We'll talk about platforms in today's session. Lots of people ask, should I use Zoom Webinar? Should I use On24? Should I use Hopin, Connect? What should I use? Brian's actually creating a guide to figure that out, because he's actually done all the demos so that you don't have to. It's a service to us all.
74 demos now. I was 68, and I've done 6 this week alone. And it's been an interesting, anything that rebranded as virtual event in their marketing, which I probably should have tightened that scope, because we know marketers sometimes will stretch that truth. But I'm excited to get that out there and share that with the world.
Yeah, we'll make sure to get you a link to that when it is completed. Thanks again to everybody for being here. A couple of quick notes that you're probably already thinking. Yes, we are absolutely recording this session. Yes, we will send it to you probably tomorrow. Yes, we will take questions. As mentioned, Brian and I'll stay online as long as you like to answer your questions today. We'll try and have the prepared content done in a regular webinar length, an hour, maybe a little less. For questions, please use the Q&A tab on your Zoom webinar control panel. For regular comments like, boy, I do love Brian, and boy, that hat really is yellow, go ahead and use the chat for that. But for actual questions that you'd like us to consider answering, please put that in the Q&A. Having both of those separate will make it a little bit easier for us to moderate questions as we go along today. So questions in the Q&A, comments in the chat. I love how everybody's talking about where they're coming from. We've got folks from New Zealand, Kia ora, Sacramento, Illinois, Brazil. Spectacular. Hey, Jesse, nice to have you here as well. Look, here's the thing. Brian and I agree on this. The truth about virtual events is that some of them kind of suck. And that's always been the case. But now virtual events are everywhere. Everybody who had a live event is now having a virtual event, and virtual events were picking up in popularity to begin with. And the challenge is that virtual events, and I'm using my air quotes now, are now going to pick up some perception baggage, because there's more virtual events than ever, and a lot of people are doing it for the first time or nearly the first time. And as a result, some of them are not going to be done very well. They're not going to be terribly interesting or dynamic or engaging for the audience. And then everybody's going to say, oh God, not another virtual event. So Brian and I are committed to fixing that, but not just randomly. We don't just want to throw out a bunch of ideas and random tips. We wanted to do this for you logically and methodically. So we put our heads together and came up with the 8 big questions. Now, look, there's probably 75 questions you probably should answer, and we'll talk about some of those today. But the 8 big categories of questions that you need to answer to do virtual events well. Are you ready? Brian, are you ready, most importantly?
I am ready. Let's do it.
All right, let's make that happen. We got questions already coming in.
I like it.
Yeah, it's great. Great. From our good friend, Nikki D'Alonso. Nikki, how's it going? First question that you need to ask friends is this. What are your objectives? What are you actually trying to accomplish? And I'm seeing this a lot. We've had so many conversations with clients and potential clients over the last 60 days on this topic. And people call and they say, well, we want to do a virtual event. Why do you say that? Well, because we used to have a regular event. All right, but an event isn't the goal. An event isn't the goal. An event is a means to an end, right? So there's a reason to have an event. So what are you actually trying to achieve? Are you trying to educate your attendees? Are you trying to motivate your attendees? Are you trying to sell to your attendees? Are you trying to connect your attendees to one another? Are you trying to connect your attendees to a third party like a sponsor or an underwriter? That's actually what you're trying to achieve. The event, the virtual event, is just the container for whatever actual business strategy or desired business outcome you're trying to effectuate. So what I always like to tell people just flat out is, well, maybe a virtual event isn't actually what you need at all. Maybe it isn't what you need at all. And I just want to take a second here to acknowledge that Brian and I very carefully planned this session so that when you see the inside scoop slides, there's an inside scoop for each of the 8 questions. You'll notice that Brian and I are wearing the exact same outfits that we wore when we took the photos that are on the inside scoop slide. Thank you very much. We appreciate your acknowledgement of our diligence and preparation. You even have the same suspenders on. Even the same suspenders. Look at that.
Yeah, I have the same hat on too. I went same hat.
I love it. So maybe it's not a virtual event, right? Maybe it's an online training course. Maybe it's a video podcast series. Maybe it's a weekly Facebook Live broadcast. Maybe it's an interactive white paper. Or, maybe it is a virtual event. But I want to caution you about saying what we need is a virtual event. What you actually need is something that accomplishes your business objectives. And maybe a virtual event does just that. But maybe it doesn't. So let's not rush to judgment. Brian, what do you think?
Yeah, I think it's so important. I think one of the things that I always try to start the conversation with is define what success looks like, and really write it out. Like, hey, the reason this is what success looks like, and then kind of start mapping those goals. Like, what are the goals that I want to measure? And I think initially, over this last couple months, as we were forced into this virtual space and the social distancing, a lot of people were looking at it like a virtual event replaces an offline event. But let's face it, we have Zoom calls that have popped up all over the place. We have webinars that have been around for 10 years. And so I think part of this comes down to definitely defining success, understanding the goals. And with the platform, with the 74 product demos, I can tell you, each product had a different value proposition. They had a different objective that they believed they could accomplish. And I won't give away the entire review, but the breaking news of that review was I didn't find one tool that did everything great or that I thought was far and away above. And part of it was because each virtual event objective and success and the goals is going to be unique. Everything from including sponsors to replacing the leads that you get at an offline event, or even one of the most popular ones that I've been seeing from a speaking perspective is I want a virtual event that is part of my all hands Zoom call that we're doing every week. And that's such a different mindset, different platform, different objectives than what you would say an offline conference that we had to cancel that had 25,000 people and we now want to move it online. So I think it's definitely important to break that down. And if we start there, it'll make a lot of the other decisions you're going to have to make a lot easier.
Real quick, I want to acknowledge a question that was asked by both Toy and Jennifer in the Q&A, which is what is an interactive white paper? So typically you would have a PDF and or a white paper type of a product on a website, and then you have interactive elements baked into it. So it could be quizzes, could be videos, could be drag and drop reconfigurations. There's companies like SnapApp, which is now part of Uberflip, that actually specialize in that, making your white paper interactive technology. Obviously doesn't really work when you print it out. That's no longer interactive. But if you see it as a PDF in a PDF reader or on the web, you can do some really interesting things right now with white papers and ebooks to make them more dynamic.
Yeah, and for those that, from just a standpoint of we talked about platform a little bit just there. I know we're going to talk about platform more, but I've actually found that in many cases, there's no platform needed. You need an actual solution provider. You need someone that's actually being able to implement this from an event execution. So I think that's also important, that I think if we start with platform, or if you start with a lower down that line, you're going to end up putting yourself in a bucket before you even get what that success is. And I think that's definitely something we have to kind of redefine as we go.
Yep, no question. Second piece that we really want you to consider is what is the pre and post experience. Now, you might think that your virtual event begins when everybody logs on, like you just did, and thank you again for being here. But that's not true. The event begins the second somebody hears about it. It begins once they see it in social media. It begins once they receive the email that promotes the event. And so you have to think about, what is the full experience? What happens before the login? What happens after we close this session? And a big part of that is the registration process. Do you need your attendees to register? If so, where? Is it inside a registration protocol that's owned by the events platform? Also, what information do you have to collect? I will tell you that virtual events registration form is not the time to try and get fax number or blood type from all of your attendees, right? It's just too much, because you can actually get some more of that information that you might need after the event. You don't need it all in advance. And the same way that the event begins the second that somebody hears about it, the event only ends, really, when the last notification is sent out in the last piece of the nurture sequence after the event actually concludes. So it could be weeks or months after this session when we actually think about this as being, quote unquote, done. And so the thing you have to ponder is, okay, well, when Brian and I are finished addressing you today, what happens next? What are you going to get? Are you going to get a link to the recording? Yes, you are. But how? Who's going to send that? Are you using the email notification system built in to the technology platform? Are you doing it on your own? Who's going to send it? Is it going to come from me? Is it going to come from somebody else? And then how do you make sure what is probably an email, how do you make sure that email is received, is opened, is clicked, is treasured? This is all part of the event experience. And I think we put too much emphasis on what happens in the 60, 120, 8-hour window of the actual when people are logged on, and not enough time spent on what happens before and after. So a couple things to think about. A lot of great virtual events, what would be great virtual events, are actually undercut by mediocre pre and post communication. So a couple things. One, make your event titles, your content titles, shorter, punchier, more descriptive for virtual events than you would in the real world. Because look, if somebody's going to get on a plane and clear their calendar and book a hotel room to join you for an event, they're not going to make choices to go to the pool or not based on the title of the keynote. They're either prone to go to the pool or they're not. In a virtual events environment, people are making more choices about how to spend their time. So how you title your stuff needs to be better. You need to pay more attention to that. Make your registration as obstacle-free as possible. Don't put a bunch of hurdles there. Create and deploy great reminders leading up to the session. I'm sure many of you, if not all of you, got reminders from us about this session. You probably all had an open-faced sandwich at some point in your life, either by choice or by accident. And you can have an open-faced sandwich, meaning there's no top piece of bread. I think that's why it's called open-faced, I guess. We've all had that, maybe as kids even. You can't have an open-faced sandwich if you turn it the other way, right? If there's no bottom bread, it's a mess. You got a big problem. You are now wearing turkey in many cases, which is suboptimal. So that's how I think about the post-event communications, right? If you don't have that bottom piece of bread, if you don't have it nailed after the session concludes, you have a real challenge on your hands. And because today, a lot of people are not going to tune in live. You don't have them captive. They're not in your ballroom. And so how you handle the distribution of your recordings becomes more important than ever. So that's why we think so much and do so much strategy work around the pre and post communication piece of all of this. To wit, let's do a quick poll. Poll question: What do you need assistance with in terms of virtual events? Now, there are 5 choices here, and this is a multiple choice poll in that you can check more than one because you may need things in multiple categories. But Brian and I are interested to see where you think you need more assistance. Look at everybody who needs platform selection, Brian. We're now at 70%, 73% of attendees need help with platform selections. You need to get that book finished.
Yes,
get on it. Yeah, finish the demos.
There you go.
70% platform selection. That is incredible.
Well, I'm curious too from the standpoint of platform. One of the things we have to think about too is, are you expecting the platform to play a role in the actual pre and post event, right? That's a big piece of these platforms. Where is it facilitating the day of event? And also if you look at that entire bucket, like let's be real, like in the virtual space, so many of the offline things we just throw into online. And like, does it need to be one day? Can it be multiple days? Like the idea that a recap of day one, maybe it's a 2-hour session, the recap of day one can drive a lot of attendees to this year's events because you're not traveling, right? Yeah. Like those things. But it's so interesting from the platform side of the house, which is interesting from that thing, is that there's a lot of these tools that almost expect or believe that you already have the marketing and the sales funnel down in that process. So I love seeing that because it's something that I've been really curious to kind of dive deeper on. Oh, look at that. We got lots of look at all those poll questions and everything coming in. I love that. So this is a lot of great, conversation. I love everybody jumping in there. And, I think with the polls as well, if there's, when we're here interacting, Jay said we were going to stick around afterwards. If, I see some of the questions that are coming in, I love seeing all those questions. If there's things like outside of the poll, or maybe some things that you can add additional context to your answer. Like if you said virtual platform, I would love to hear your thought. Are you thinking of it because of an enterprise? Is it because you don't want to have to create a landing page and a lot of the things that go on? So adding that context to the chat, I would love to hear, kind of how that all works together. And, as we kind of jump into the next section here, making your content work in that virtual setting, which is, I think, also one of those big gaps that we've seen, because although I think we both believe that virtual events will never replace offline events, the offline event has certain limitations and certain capabilities, and virtual does as well. I think if we can take our mind and say, okay, let's remove the things that were limitations offline, including content and pre and post, and reinvent them online, this is where we can really make a big difference.
Evelyn had a quick question, Brian, on how do we do the poll right there. We'll talk more about interactivity in just a second, but that particular poll is built into Zoom webinar. So you just create the poll. There'll be 2 other poll opportunities for you later in today's session, and you just build it in there, and then we just press a button, and it automatically launches for you.
All right, so we have up there now, making your content work in that virtual setting. How much information do you anticipate providing? I think that's a big one, Jay. I don't know what you've been seeing as well. I think, the idea of not only the shorter attention span, but, one of the big things that I think is something we have to hit home, and it's not its own individual question, but I think it's fundamental across all of these questions, is that for the last 10 years, the audience has an expectation of what a virtual event is. And let's face it, more than likely, it's probably not a very good expectation. I know I get in the habit of signing up for 10 webinars that I don't plan on attending live. And so part of this content piece is, what are we going to do to not only shape that, but how can we manage expectations? How can we educate that audience so that they can leverage that and really take that to the next level when it comes to content?
Yeah, and one of the things we talk about here, right, is that if everybody's in the same room, in a ballroom, they are by definition on the same time zone. That's how time works and space. But in a virtual event, right, we have people joining us from New Zealand, and I don't even know when. It's like 5 days from now in New Zealand, and Brazil, and so we've got people in today's session in very, very different times, and so you got to contend with that in a virtual event. Yeah.
Yeah, and for sure. And I think the other piece of that too, and I see some of the questions coming in about, when we think about content in the virtual space, we have to leverage the content that exists, right? So in the idea where, traditionally offline, hey, I'm going to be on stage and you can't bring multiple people on there. If you're including videos in your presentation, you're usually keeping them snappy and you're not sure if the AV is going to work. I think there's also a role to play in content before the actual event, right? How much content can you serve them up? Watch these YouTube videos to set the stage for the presentation, and also even kind of reinventing the idea of a workshop and a keynote and how those kind of content are not only streamlined, but I believe the content that you're using pre-event as well as post-event will also make a big difference on how many people turn up live, how many people maintain attention, including the fact that, what kind of technology or integration such as polls and some of the things that we talked about can really take that to the next level. And so I think, it's not only redesigning the types of content, right? Like, okay, if it's going to be video or, one of the things I think we can also do is, kind of make that choose your own adventure element where you're able to give them a live, some live content and then tell them, here's a link for a video and here's a link for a podcast recording. Whichever you prefer to consume, feel free to consume that on your own and really empowering the audience. We're almost giving the audience much more control in the virtual content space compared to what we would offline, just because of that, distance and limitations that we have.
Yeah, and of course, the shorter the session is, or the shorter the event is, the theoretically easier it is to hold attention. And we wanted to ask you about that. I'm going to launch this poll here. How long you anticipate your next virtual event to be? Is it 1 to 60 minutes, as we consider this particular session to be? Is it a couple hours? Is it a half day, a full day, multiple days? What I have seen anecdotally, Brian, I think you'll agree, in the conversations that I've been having with clients and potential clients is all over the board. Everything from 3 full days to 30 minutes, and not as much of a standard emerging in that. And we'll see how the audience says.
And even the platforms from a standpoint of what they enable and how you make that happen. Like, it's interesting. And I saw some comments about like webinar being, I think, webinars play a role and there's an exact reason for how webinars are created. And there's also a difference between back-to-back webinars on one day versus a webinar series that you can, record and consume on your one. And I think, I love this question in the sense of, what do you expect for that event? And then almost like how many days do you plan on breaking it down? How much do you believe will be live versus recorded? And I think if your goal isn't the live element, isn't, having to show up, then there's completely different strategy than you would before. And so I love that, over 50% are saying, they're anticipating their virtual event being that 1 to 60 minute range.
Yeah, and by the same token, we got 22% to say it's going to be 4 hours to multiple days. So while
Wow.
Certainly more of the attendees here are thinking a format not dissimilar from what we're doing today, there's also a decent chunk of folks, dozens and dozens of you, who are thinking about really having what we would consider to be more of a virtual summit, quote unquote, for lack of a better term. But Brian and I certainly agree on a lot of these points here, that your how you interpret time is different when you're looking into a computer, yeah?
For sure. And not only that, but let's face it, we've been trained. We spent the last 10 years when we sign up for a webinar or even a video. I can tell you for a lot of times for me, I don't watch YouTube videos, I listen to them, right? They're on tab number 447 on my list of Google Chrome tabs, and I'm listening to the content. And I think, when we think about that, if you want people to have it front and center, you have to tell them why. You need to tell them that's important. You have to give them content that is show, not tell type content, right? If you're just doing all telling, there's a reason that they're on that back, piece. And then there's also the idea of it's not a short attention span. We just have more options and no time for crappy content, right? And so when you think about that, and we're thinking about these sessions, there is also this idea for me that I really love, is that traditionally, Jay, you and I speak at a lot of the same events, it's 60-minute sessions or 45-minute sessions, sometimes longer, and we're just going back to back, and we're flying out at the end of the day. I love the idea of interchanging, right? Like an 8-minute session from Jay, a 10-minute session from, our good friend Lauren who's in there, and then an 8-minute session from someone else, and then Jay coming back and giving another session. You can really get creative in that variety. And, I think there's also one of those things where when you're looking at jumping on virtual, just taking a presentation and talking into a video camera is really no different than a YouTube video. And you know, when we ask the audience, you know, this is a thing that I've been working a lot with, you know, those from a webinar perspective, they oftentimes evaluate it like, I'm going to consume that when I consume my YouTube or my Netflix. And if you expect that participatory element, right, which is, I love live video, right? Like, I work really hard in telling people through live videos, Facebook Live, is that it's me on screen, but it's you helping me direct the path. And I think that's something that is important in the content. But I will tell you, if you don't educate your audience on what they're expected prior to and what the content expectations are, it doesn't matter how interactive you are. And we're going to show you some cool interactive things a little bit later. It can be the coolest interactive thing. And if someone has it on tab 400 and they're passively listening, or they didn't realize that was part of your event, they will never see it, right? And I think that is definitely something to think about. I think it's part of the education process, you know, and there's also, you know, some incentivization on that as well. And I think, you know, one of the other pieces too is rehearsal. I made this comment, you know, I rehearsed for a 20-minute talk that I gave 2 nights ago, far more than I've ever rehearsed for any offline thing that I've ever done in my entire life, right? It was not only making, you know, it's making something simple is hard, right? Making something drag on for forever is very easy. And I talk pretty fast, so you would think that would help out in there. And, you know, I think that's extremely important. And then understanding the different types of content is also important. And I think, Jay, you know, I think this is also where both of us love to play. We love video. We host podcasts. We like live video. We do webinars. And I think they all have a role, but we have to understand their value and then where they go from there.
Yeah, absolutely. And this thing we mentioned in this slide about presenters who don't speak for a living having a harder time doing a good virtual talk than a physical talk is so true. And I know it sounds counterintuitive, friends. I know you think, well, geez, all you got to do is talk into your laptop. Like, how hard could that be? If you don't do this over and over, people tend to get really nervous, more nervous in a virtual format than if they're actually holding a microphone on a stage in front of a ballroom of their peers. It's just that they're just not as used to the physicality of this format. And so you really do need to practice with your speakers a lot and get them to rehearse and get comfortable with this format, because it's not as easy as they might think. And
I don't know about you, Jay, but for me, you know, I said earlier, I've done a little over 3,000 live streams. And I mean, not only was I horrible at the first 100, but like it's one of those things that you get used to, and, you know, figuring out, you know, different ways to do it. I was on a call yesterday with someone that was, you know, an on-camera talent. And she was talking about, you know, having the teleprompter and the things that she did prior to, you know, going live. And I think a lot of those things are important because in a traditional, you know, offline event, we're getting nonverbal feedback. We also
can read the room.
Yeah, and we know the limitations, right? Like, this is one of the things that I know scares people with video, is that we have no idea who's going to see it, and we are really concerned on the unknown feedback, right? Like, it's interesting. Like, we have 5,000 people in a room that we can see their feedback, but yet the idea that we have unknown feedback is a scarier element. I think that's one of those things too that takes practice, takes time, and, you know, and for those that are looking, right, Jay and I are both standing up right now. And for me, one of those pieces of standing up versus sitting down is it's all about that emotion that you generate. And for a lot of people, talking to a screen, to a camera, is an extremely hard emotion to generate, right? Like, you know, maybe you're doing jumping jacks ahead of time. Our good friend Mike Ganino, I know Mike he starts a conversation with his best friend and has the conversation going, and then clicks his recording and then jumps into it because he's already got that momentum going. And so I think that's important. And then when we look at that and like, how do we handle video? This is something else that I think all 3 aspects of events have to think about, right? So the speakers and hosts, those brands and businesses that are putting on the event, and then also the platform and what you plan to do with video. And so this is where, you know, I think it's a very interesting, probably the most confusing element for me over the last 60 days is how people look at these different aspects of video. So when I look at it, you know, especially from my speaking, you have the traditional, let's say live video, which we're doing this now, right? We're doing this live, and live can include slides. It can include a lot of different characteristics. Of course, a lot of people picture Facebook Lives that as a live video, and I always make the connection that, you know, live video is great because anyone can go live. Most live video sucks because anyone can go live, right? Like, let's be real. Like, there's an element of what live does. You have to carry the conversation. And then you have to kind of take it through and understand, okay, you have live video, and then you have the pre-recorded video where it's, you're able to, deliver, you're able to pause, do multiple takes. And then I think that third piece there is understanding like production level video and where you go from there. And so I think when you're looking at this, not only do you have to find speakers that understand video, but some speakers are going to be better in certain aspects of video than others, right? And I think this is one of those things that you want to make sure are important. And on top of that, I think all video creators have learned this. Like as soon as you learn how to do transition slides in iMovie or Camtasia or Adobe Premiere, you add like 3,000 of them. And then you watch the video and you're like, that was the worst decision.
I overdid it a little bit. Yeah.
Like, oh, but like, I mean, we've done it like, when the first time Keynote had like the transition in the text, right? Like my text was on fire every single time. And then like by the third time, you're like, yeah, I'm never going to use that animation again, right? And so,
well, and it's even harder when you've got. I mean, we talked about a lot of our attendees here having, 4, 6, 8, 2-day sessions, presumably with lots of different presenters. And so, one of the challenges with video is, maybe you have somebody who is comfortable with video, and maybe they even have a light like I have, or multiple lights like I have, and Brian has. Maybe they've got a decent camera like I do, and Brian does. But then, does everybody? Like, if you've got 8 presenters, how do you make it feel somewhat consistent? From speaker to speaker inside your virtual summit or virtual event. That's kind of the tricky thing. And so you got to kind of say, all right, what can we get everybody to handle in their own home, presumably, so that at least we have some measure of consistency.
Yeah, and the person that taught me this was actually you, Jay, because for those that are part of Social Pros, the very first time I was on Social Pros, I think it was 2014, before I was a guest, I got a Logitech microphone sent to me in the mail. And I was like, Jay, I do podcasts. And Jay was like, no, we want consistent audio from our guests so that we know the levels that are coming in. And, I think for speakers, we have to respect that as well. And I think when you're doing back-to-back sessions or even recording these, you also have to think about that in a bigger picture. And for a lot of these platforms, especially where the video is actually being housed in the content management system, and then what the video is being streamed and pushed out on are in some cases 2 different pieces, right? And so I know a lot of people talk about gear. I think there's an interesting balance. And for some of the events, there's actually 2 of the events I'm working with right now, we're building out their kit. And so all 8 speakers are gonna get the same kit because we're at home. Now, let's say 3 months from now where we're on like semi-social distancing, maybe it's sending everybody to a local studio. Jay, you and I have done that before.
Mm-hmm.
I was in San Francisco actually in January, and we did an entire virtual event for SEM Rush, and we were all the speakers were in the same studio, yet it was only broadcasted, online. And so there was variables you control. And so I think this is something important, is the number of variables you add, also add the number of the amount of risk, right? There we go. We got a little virtual background that we can.
Yeah, but I mean, this is what you can do is in some platforms, right? If you can't get all your speakers to get, to get something behind them or get their physical environment right, you can use a virtual background. I happen to be now coming to you from an aquarium. So that's one of the ways to kind of cheat that process.
And I also think, Jay, you're wearing a lavalier microphone right now, and I'm using, for those that are wondering, I'm using a Blue Yeti microphone that's directional, right? But Jay and I are both also podcasters, and so we both also have, other types of, equipment and gear. And I think, look at that. So, wow, we both, that wasn't even planned. But I think there's also something to be said on you not expecting your speakers to know all of this, but also managing that expectation and setting the bar. Like, hey, I would love for you that if you're not using an external speaker, let's make sure you are using AirPods or some kind of audio device. Like for me, there's Jay's using an AirPod. If anyone's watched any news channel, or I'm a dad of 3 girls. I watched the Disney sing-along series the other night, and everyone, Christina Aguilera was singing from her bed with her AirPods on, right? And so I think these are things that you have to factor in. And I also think the technology should not be a roadblock. It should be something that you understand and you evaluate the risk versus the reward. And how important is 1080 video of all of my speakers versus a live stream of all of my speakers that doesn't crash and doesn't have latency, right? And I think that's something that you also kind of have to evaluate as you move forward.
Yeah, and one of the things we mentioned here in the last part of this slide is good video is terrific. Everybody prefers it. But mediocre audio is a deal breaker, right? So if you've got to pick one, always pick audio.
Yep.
Because just like a podcast, right? If the audio isn't at least pretty good, you will stop listening. Same thing with a webinar, same thing with a virtual event. Is it better to have, your speakers have lights and a decent background? Totally. Yes, it is better, but it's not a deal breaker. Audio is non-negotiable. So when you're thinking about how to produce your virtual events, get audio dialed and then worry about video.
And I think, and the audio can come in multiple different forms, right? So you have the lavalier, I have the handheld. You can do a boom one off of the room, depending on your environment. For me, I'm in about a 12 by 12 office in my house, and as long as my door is open, there's not an echo, and I don't get the noise cancellation. And so those are some things that you're going to think about as well. And then also, when all of these things come together, there's some questions about sponsor integration, right? Like, I love the idea that if you're worried about the background of the different videos for your speakers, sending them a step and repeat with your sponsors' logos on it. Now you just eliminated that risk, and you're adding a new component, right? You're taking advantage of this landscape. And for me, I have a blackboard and a whiteboard on the other side, and I'm using this white background at the moment because we're going to do a visual in a little bit. But I think these are those things that when we at first look at it, it can be risky. And I give a shout out to Adobe. Both Jay and I have worked with Adobe on many occasions, and Adobe launched their Adobe Summit virtually very early on, and it was all pre-recorded video, but they allowed all of their employees to kind of show a bit of their house, but it had kind of the same feel, right? It was all the same 9 and 16 box, but some people, it was their living room, some people it was their dining room. The CEO was standing in front of his bedroom door because he thought that was the best lighting. And so that real raw element is important, but it's also that consistency is more important than anything else, and especially when it comes to audio.
A couple of quick questions. Brian, I'm going to stop sharing right now. And while I do that, I'll take a couple of questions and you can get your overlay ready. A couple of questions. Yep. Mike asked, what's a step and repeat? Mike, it's like the backdrop that you see people take pictures in front of where it has the logos, and it's called step and repeat because the logo kind of steps and repeats. So like if it's like on a red carpet and behind you is the Rolex logo a million times, that's in the industry called a step and repeat. A good question from Mo asks, why do artists and news correspondents only wear one AirPod or one headset piece? It's so that you can still hear somebody shouting at you, or a train is coming or something like that out of your other ear. It's just so you can kind of have two conversations going at once. I used to do a lot of TV when I was younger, and the system works a lot better now in the AirPod days. It's so simple. Back in those cases, you had a really expensive, specialized equipment. All right, Brian, are you ready?
I'm ready. Let's do it. So for those that are watching there, you might be on your phone. You have to make sure you hit fit screen on your screen. But when it comes to visuals or video overlays, I look at this and say the possibilities are endless, right? The available places we can go. And so you'll notice there's no green screen here. And this is live, right? I'm not recorded. But what I'm using is Prezi videos. So you might be familiar with Prezi as I always like to say the snake visual presentation format. And they have a new product. I say new. It came out in November. I discovered it early March as I was looking for some fun interactive solutions. And so I customized this one for a presentation, one of my keynotes and actually a shout out to my dad. He's actually watching. My dad sent me a text. And so this is a slide I actually talk about my dad's core values and the things that are extremely important to him in my presentation, of course, wearing my Steeler gear as well. And so this is a presentation that I customized. I actually gave the presentation last night. And so this is a video overlay. So I'm using virtual camera. So we're still in Zoom. I have Prezi video running here on the side, and I was able to actually customize this. Now, the learning curve for that is a little steep. There's some things you're going to get used to from presenting, but this kind of possibility, right? Not only using broadcasting overlays, which a lot of tools, one of my favorite tools for broadcasting overlays is Ecamm Live, but this idea of, look at that interactivity where if you're giving people a reason to show up, right? This is all, kind of taking things to that next interactive activity. And so, I've done this now. I've given this using Prezi about 4 times. And, one of the interesting pieces is I don't want people to, the only takeaway they get from my presentation is that I use Prezi, right? So there's that balance. And I know early adoption is one of those things, but I also think it's definitely an element where I had multiple people say in my most recent session, they said, the reason I stayed to the end was I wanted to see how each one of these interactive things were utilized, right? And if you think about that from a marketing perspective or a presentation perspective. If you can include something that creates that curiosity and that intrigue that keeps people around for super long, then it can open this up. And this isn't any fancy technology. I mean, literally no green screen. I'm using a Logitech Brio web camera, and I'm using the Prezi Video solution. So Prezi Video, I will say the only limitation is that it does mirror your video. So as you can tell, my hat, you guys can't read my hat on there.
His hat is backwards.
But I've talked to the CEO, and he said he's going to work on that. And there's some other tools that are out there as well that I've been testing with overlays, transitions, integrating video and audio. I actually was trying before this session, and I'll kick back to my regular video for this. But one of the things I was trying for this that I couldn't get to work well was there's a couple of hologram programs. And so I have Baer in a very nice PNG video, and I tested it out with a Brene Brown quote and then a Baer one where you can actually put a hologram even on screen. So there are some possibilities for us in that arena.
That's great, Brian. A quick question. Is there a free version of Prezi Video like that?
So I believe it's a 14-day trial right now. It is something that you do have to pay for. It's somewhere in like the $35 a month range. But I've talked to the CEO a couple of times, and I know they have a couple other things that are rolling out with Prezi Video.
Kristen asks, would you recommend using an external webcam? I have a Logitech Brio. Brian also has a Logitech Brio versus your onboard camera. I would say yes. Your external webcam will be better. I would not use audio from your external webcam. They can do audio, but it's usually terrible, so I wouldn't do that. But for video, yes. The challenge is, as a practical matter right now, because of the pandemic and everybody working from home, the chances of you finding a webcam for sale is like 0%.
Zero.
But
yeah, and so and like think, when you look at part of it, like here's we'll make everybody a little bit sick, but like if you think about it too, Jay, you and I are using the standing desk, right? And I think as much as we both travel, which is a ton for different presentations, we've stacked furniture in hotels to be able to stand in front of your machine. Mm-hmm. And so if you're using an external computer, one of the benefits we often don't hear is that you can actually take that with that cord and you can put it somewhere high to where you don't have to have your machine or your desk or invest. And so I think a lot of times people look at that kind of technology and look at it as a barrier to entry. And so if I was telling somebody standing desk or external web camera, I'm going to say external web camera all day because you can be creative with making a standing desk versus the external camera.
Your laptop is your laptop, yeah. Ruth asks, and we talked about this earlier today offline, what other things you can use Prezi Video for, not just Zoom, but it'll work in other technologies as well?
I've tried it on 6 different virtual event platforms. It also does record live. They actually have a native RTMP out, so you can stream directly to Facebook Live. You can even stream to their platform at Prezi.com, has their own live video hosting there, which I think is really neat. You can even embed that in some different places. It is a newer tool. I know a lot of teachers are using it, a lot of the e-learning space. That limitation of not being able to hold up a book because it's mirrored is definitely one of those things there that is a thing to worry about. But I will tell you, hey, there's my dad just said, hey, from Mr. Fan. So my dad even figured out how to use Zoom chat. Like, that's breaking news. Like, my dad getting my dad on Zoom is like the quarantine win here. But I think that's something to think about as well when you're looking at these pieces. Now, I will tell you, like, Zoom rolled out an update last week, and that update actually broke Prezi Video. So I'm actually using a version of Zoom 2 versions behind, and it's it's a virtual cam component. And so anytime you're adding these kind of elements, as great as they are, it is definitely important to be aware of that. Yesterday afternoon, I accidentally just hit update, and this morning when I went to test it, I was like, why is that not showing up? And I knew that you had to have an old version. I forgot hitting the update button, and so that's definitely something you're going to want to think about when you're adding that. But the creativity level of Prezi is all over the map, but they do have some video overlays. The other thing that I can tell you with both Prezi and Ecamm Live, which Ecamm is the tool that I use for almost all of my live streaming, you can record locally with the tools. So it doesn't mean, just because those graphics were live, doesn't mean you have to be recording it with an audience. You can actually record it directly to your machine, do some editing as well. So with Prezi as well as Ecamm, when I said, live video, pre-recorded video, and produced video, you can actually hit each one of those leveraging, those kind of tools.
It's fantastic. We'll get back to it because we got a lot to cover here in just a few minutes. I'm going to see if we can make all this work again. And I think it is. We'll get some more tech questions at the end for folks. We talked about a lot of this already. How interactive do you want this session to be? As interactive as you can, really, because just watching a virtual session in your computer is the worst kind of Netflix. So you want to do audience questions, as we've been doing throughout the session. A couple ways to do that, though. You can do them via chat. You can do them via Q&A, as we're doing here. You can also allow audience questions via audio. There is a function actually to do that in Zoom Webinar, where you can have the audience raise their hand, and if we press a button, we could hear you, and you could do an audience audio question. I don't like to do that personally. It can get a little distracting because I don't know what your audio setup is, and so that can be a little bit tricky. So I don't typically do that unless the session is relatively small. Other thing for you to think about: are you going to take questions in the middle, and we're trying to answer some that are particularly relevant while we're talking about it, and then we'll take a lot more at the end. I think that's the best practice. But you have to have somebody who's running the session who can kind of read the questions and then pull them in real time. So as Brian is talking, I'm looking at all the questions, and as I'm talking, he's looking at all the questions and answering back and forth. But Brian and I do this a lot, so we're very comfortable sort of doing two things at once. Not all of folks in your organization are going to want to do that, so something to think about. Also,
Jay, we also have Tink on the back end here, and actually I used to run a Google Hangout show, live show and Twitter chat, and that was one of the things that Tink ran on the background. And I think one of the things that I've heard that really people haven't thought about is there are a lot of people that are really great at being remote virtual event producers in this perspective, right? They're great at driving audience conversation in the chat. They're great at serving up different questions. I know Tink and I went through our live video days, would have a live Google Doc, and she would be copying them in, and I would just see the Google Doc update, and if I happen to answer one, she'd remove it. And there's lots of ways you can get creative with that. I think the limitation really starts to become when you're by yourself, right? You're the only one on there. And I will tell you, this is a lesson I learned with live video. Manage expectations out of the gate. We did that here on this webcast. If you don't want to get off track and be distracted, let them know at the very beginning. I'm going to take questions at the end. And everybody that's watching right now, do me a favor. If someone jumps in after we've got started, please let them know that I'm going to answer their questions later on. I'm not ignoring them. It kind of frees you up. Because video is intimidating. Live video is intimidating. Adding all these different components, now I have to present, I have to watch a chat, I have to monitor questions, I got to make sure I'm live. And so the more that you can manage that expectation in that interactivity component, the easier it is, and then also leverage your team.
Yeah, and in a lot of these platforms, including this one, you can pull attendees into smaller groups. So a lot of times in the event business, you have sort of the keynote room where everybody's in the same room, and then you've got breakouts where you've got maybe 50, 100, 200 people in little rooms, or 5 or whatever. You can do that here. So I could right now go into our platform here and take any group of you and pull you into a breakout room where you could all talk amongst yourselves. We won't do that in this session, but that is available in many of these virtual event platforms. Something to think about to add interactivity. We think you should add as much interactivity as you can within reason without it being hokey. Train your presenters to use polls. When Brian and I put this session together, we had the polls inserted for a reason, because we want to make sure that you have the opportunity to kind of weigh in as well. Use an MC or a host to interact with the audience before, during, and after, and collate and ask the questions. For any session over an hour or so, Brian and I believe it's almost mandatory for you to have some sort of a host to kind of stitch the whole thing together and frankly keep the energy high. I don't like taking questions via audio and video in a virtual format. As I mentioned, it's a little hard to control it. And I think the key philosophy here is you can't just take your offline presentation and talk into your computer. It just doesn't work like that. And you saw with Brian's overlay some of the cool things you can do. Now, if you're going to have a virtual session, you want people to show up live if possible. We had many people show up live for this session, thanks to all of you. But you want to make sure that people do that, because if they don't show up live and they're like, yeah, I'm going to get the recording, well, they may or may not do that. In fact, the replay watch rate is typically less than 20%. So in other cases, people will show up for the first 20 minutes and then leave, and they don't come back. And you also have some time zone issues to think about for tuning in live as well. So Brian, you want to talk a little bit about the inside scoop on getting people to tune in live instead of like, yeah, I'll get the replay later.
So I think one of the things that we have to think about this is, back to that very first slide, like it's the goals. What are the things that you want? And if you do want that engagement, you want to foster that conversation. And I would make the argument, it's the closest we get to offline interaction is live video where it's participatory. You have to give them reasons, right? And so I think there's some incentivization you can do. One of the things that I've been actually working with my clients on is that, hey, the recording's available of the presentations, but you don't get the Q&A section unless you're watching live, right? Like you can add that kind of element in there. Even bringing attendees onto camera. Zoom allows that functionality where, hey, we're going to pick one person that raises their hand or asks a question in the audience. I see we have Chris Anderson here, right? If I wanted to, I could bring Chris on a video. And I think these are things that you can definitely incorporate in that live component, maybe even including sponsor giveaways. Actually two of the platforms that I tested actually had content timer based, right? So they would say, if you watch 2 hours of content of the 4, it would allow you to watch an exclusive interview that was only available for those that watched 2 hours or more content, right? Like you can get a little bit creative there. And so I think it's important to understand if live attendance is not the goal, it's not the main reason you're doing it, then maybe you should prioritize some of these other pieces. But if that is something that you want, then you have to give them a reason. You have to manage that expectation. I like, one of the things that I'm doing in my presentations is I'm bringing in surprise influencers where, at 10 minutes into my talk, I'm gonna have 3 influencers come in on screen with me and do a conversation. And
are they cats or they're actual people?
Cats, tigers, right? I think right. Tiger King is the live from jail.
I'm gonna do the guess what's in my hand. Guess what is in my hand.
We could do the Joe Exotic from the picture in picture, right? And so I think those are pieces that you want to factor in, and the fear of missing out, right? Like I think that's also something that is important, to not only give people a reason to tune in, but give them what they're going to miss if they don't tune in. And that's something you have to train them along the way. And I will say one of the other things that is really interesting that I hadn't thought of, and I don't think I've even brought this up to you, Jay, is that been working with a couple of different apps, and I started testing mobile apps. And one of the things I realized was the mobile app for a virtual event, especially a multi-day virtual event, is actually that solution for that 360-degree opportunity where someone could watch the opening keynote and on their app on their phone say, hey, give me a push notification to tune into these live sessions. Because a lot of these virtual event platforms, they'll give you a calendar invite for the day, but you can't really customize, hey, when am I going to get notified? Or even the idea of, hey guys, did you know that we're about to do a giveaway? Make sure you jump back in, because we have all these notifications. Our calendars are booked. Thinking about ways that you can jump in front of that, very busy, active, distracted, millennial ADHD, that's me, user is extremely important.
We talked a little bit about adding sponsor value before, so we can go through this one pretty quickly. The reality is you're probably still going to need sponsors for a lot of events. I mean, they cover a lot of the expenses for events, whether they're live or virtual. And so if you don't have an exhibit hall in the classic sense, what can you do to make the event attractive for sponsors? A few different things. One, feature your sponsors in the all-important pre- and post-event communications. Have live Q&As with the speakers that are then hosted by sponsors before the event. So for example, Brian and I could have done a Facebook Live yesterday talking about what we're going to do, teasing this, and had a sponsor bring that to you.
I did a Periscope about 3 hours ago, teasing that all on Twitter before the event.
Yeah, and we could have had a sponsor underwrite that. We didn't, but we could have. Brian talked about this idea of doing virtual backgrounds, like the aquarium I showed you earlier. Well, I did an aquarium, but it could easily be a sponsor logo back here, right? This could be Oracle or Cisco or somebody else that we work with, Adobe back here. That's very, very simple. Can also allow attendees to jump into the breakout rooms we talked about and be able to have productive conversations with sponsors there, which is more similar to an exhibit hall format that you may have seen in the past. And some of the virtual event platforms actually have, sort of exhibit halls in the classic sense that will serve that role for you. You can also have your sponsors handle the poll. So we've done some polls here. You could have a sponsor underwrite that and say, this poll, this interactive element is brought to you by, Brian Fanzo's dog. And then we could send that dog an invoice.
So there you go. So Fanzo's yogurt. My family.
Yeah, there you go. Fanzo's. This session brought to you by Fanzo's. It's yogurt, 19th hole, shakes, splits, and sundaes. Exactly. So the question that a lot of people asked in the poll earlier was, what platform should you use? We can't answer that for you definitively because we don't know exactly what you need. As mentioned, Brian's doing a whole report on that, but there's a couple of things to think about, right? Registration, pre and post event communications, how many people do you need to be logged on simultaneously, a lot of other things. Brian, what else do you want to tell them before we log off here?
No, yeah, I think one of the things the platform is, there's different elements. You have the webinar platforms, you have the virtual event platforms, you have trade show virtual platforms, you have live video, Facebook Live, you have those type of enablers. But then you also have like the video conferencing solutions, right? Beyond, you have Blue Jeans and Zoom, Google Meet, and I think they all present different options, different pieces. And I think when you're looking at putting on a massive multi-speaker event, that platform is essential to understand all of the variables. But then if you're thinking about integrating, a virtual experience or maybe a couple hours of a virtual talk into something that you have going on, maybe that's something that you could leverage just one platform. And I know for us as speakers, we have a turnkey solution, and we also have the ability to play into your platform. And I don't think that's going to be available for all speakers that are out there. And probably one of the biggest things is that if there are things that you want or you're interested, one of the feedback I got from a lot of the vendors was, no one's asked that question before. And I started being like, okay, I started hearing that over and over. And one of the things I realized was we've kind of became just like, oh, well, this webinar platform doesn't allow us to go live. So we're just voicing over slides. But have we figured that out? Have we tested that solution out? And I think something you said is extremely important. I don't believe there's one that fits everything. There's a lot of platforms that allow you to use multiple tools. You have login, but you have to think about things, everything from speaker login, right? Do you want to give a speaker an affiliate code to promote your event? Where are they housing their content? Are they uploading it into Google Drive? Where are you housing it before, during, and after? All of these type of components are included, extremely important in that piece. But I will hit it back to that very first part where defining success of your event before you look at the platform is extremely important. If you start with the platform, your possibility of success is limited based on what the platform is providing. And I can tell you a lot of the platforms are innovative platforms using 2010, 2015 technology, right? And I think, it's part of that reason is we haven't given them attention, right? Like as a speaker, I'm a virtual person, and a lot of them are saying like, Brian, you didn't ask me. And I was like, well, I wasn't getting paid my speaker fee, and I didn't have everybody asking me. And so now, I don't blame the platforms as much as the fact that, hey, we have this new attention, we have this new priority. And there's also the avatars, right? You can do virtual reality and augmented reality avatars. And these are all things that you can factor in. But like we said throughout this presentation, there's things to get people excited to be a part of. But don't forget what your goals and success are when you're looking at those platforms. And probably the thing that I think of the most at the end there is your host, your MC, or your event planner producer is essential for this solution at the moment, because you're going to have to collaborate tools. You're going to have to collaborate different types of video. Just because you tell everybody to send you a recorded video doesn't mean it's going to be in the same format, doesn't mean it's going to be the same style. So these things are really essential. And I've been making the argument a little bit over the last couple of weeks that if you can get a really good host and MC that understands the platform you're using, let them pick the platform that they're best at, and it will save you amount of time that you couldn't even imagine.
And I'll remind everybody that Brian's putting together a report on all the platforms. We'll make sure you get a link to that when it is completed. Okay, let's see what I want to do here. We're going to skip that poll and go right here. If you go to this address, we'll put it in the chat as well, bit.ly/virtual rocks. We've got a little form there. We're going to send you the recording for this session probably tomorrow. But if you need help with content, if you need help with marketing, if you need help with pre and post event communications, if you need a MC or host for your event, if you need platform, technology, advice, and counsel, any of the things that you might need, go to bit.ly/virtualrocks, answer like 2 questions, and somebody on our team will get back to you quickly. And then we can get connected to myself, to Brian, to people on our team at Convince&Convert. We want you to have the best possible virtual events in the world that will make us very, very happy. Brian? Indeed.
I love that. And I think part of this too is, we're learning as we're going. That's part of, us sharing that, this webinar and doing it. It's just the 2 of us coming together. And, we're very lucky too from our speaking experience, working with bureaus, working with clients, having a lot of that, overlap. I think one of the things too is that you most of the time don't know what you don't know, and being able to kind of collaborate and be, hopefully inspired to ask certain questions, look at certain things. And, I think this is where I'm excited to see where we can take this, because I truly do look at the only limitations that we have at the moment in the virtual space is our own creativity. And if we can help you with that creativity, if we can help drive that home, I'm excited to be a part of that.